Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about a research project conducted by the University of Portsmouth concerning victims and computer misuse. I'm joined by Professor Mark Button, who's going to talk about this project. Professor Button, hello.
Hello.
I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the project that you undertook.
Yes, we were commissioned by the Home Office and Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary to look at victims of computer misuse. This included 52 interviews with victims, individuals and SMEs, a survey of 252 victims, as well as some interviews with stakeholders. Computer misuse crime are things like hacking, computer viruses, ransomware, and to date there's been very little research on this type of crime, and particularly victims of this type of crime. So it is a unique project.
Okay. I'm interested in the impact that obviously from this project. Could you tell me what victims experienced? What was their common feedback?
Yes. Well, there's been little research on this. ONS, in their experimental statistics, did look at this, and they found very little impact where it was any disruption. But in our interviews with these victims, we found much more significant impacts, similar to other types of crimes like burglary. So, for instance, we found victims who had psychological and emotional impacts like anxiety, anger. We had victims who experienced health problems, mental health problems. Some of them, it was so severe that some were actually considering suicide. Some even had sat on a bridge and contemplated suicide. We also found changes in behavior as a result of victimization. We also found that some victims compared these, if you like, digital attacks to actual physical attacks. They were that severe on them, with a couple of victims even comparing it to rape. It was that bad. And of course, we did find some victims who suffered financial impacts, although that was often not significant. But sometimes victims did have to pay for costs such as a new laptop, new computers, etc., as a consequence of the attack.
Okay. It's a wealth of issues there that you've unearthed then. I mean, computer misuse crime is very common, isn't it, really, from the readings that you see every day about computer misuse crime. But one of the areas is that people are not reporting it. Do you think there's a tendency for victims not to think it's very serious?
Well, we actually asked this question to the victims in the interviews and in the survey. And we found there certainly were a small minority of victims who did regard it as a lesser crime. But the vast majority of the victims thought it was either equivalent to a crime such as burglary, or in some cases even worse. And we got some quantitative data on this, where we asked victims to rate various crimes on a scale of 1 to 20, where 20 is the most serious. Burglary was rated at 9.48. But if we take, for instance, ransomware, that was just over 11, and hacking for voyeurism was also just over 11. So the victims actually regarded these crimes as much more serious.
Okay. So if we go back then to why many are not reporting it, then why do you think then victims don't report?
Yes, well, it's a good point. I mean, when we consider that the ONS finds, in terms of individual victims, there are probably about 1 million victims of this type of crime every year, and that obviously excludes organisations. And around about 20-odd thousand are actually recorded. There is a huge attrition there. Now, some of that is accounted for by the actual incidents being recorded as a higher offence, because often computer misuse is used to commit more serious offences. But clearly there are also lots of victims not reporting. Now, obviously in some situations that is because they regard it as a minor incident of inconvenience and they don't think it's worth reporting. Some don't lose any money, so they think, what's the point in reporting? But there are other reasons, and there are people who do want to report, but there are difficulties in actually going about reporting. So first of all, there are challenges for some victims finding out where to report to. If you go, for instance, to many police force websites, there is not provision on those websites to tell you how to report computer misuse crime. Lots of stuff about burglary and assault and hate crime, those types of things, but not computer misuse crime. If we go to the Action Fraud website, it's obviously called Action Fraud, not Action Computer Misuse Crime. So that puts off a lot of potential victims who don't think that their actual crime is related to fraud. So there are some of those barriers, and we did also find some victims who actually went to the police and they were told that it wasn't a crime. So for instance, we had one victim who had her webcam hacked, and she went to the police and they said it wasn't a crime. And another example of a lady who was estranged from her husband, who had hacked her laptop in divorce negotiations, and again, it was considered not a crime. So I think there are a lot of structural barriers out there as well, stopping victims being able to report.
Okay. So on that note then, would you feel that bodies are doing enough to help victims?
First of all, I think there is a lot of work, hard work out there, but I think a lot of organisations could do much better. So if we take, for instance, websites offering advice and support, there are various websites out there of varying quality. Probably the most recognised one is the Action Fraud website, but that actually doesn't provide a great deal of information on computer misuse crime. So that could be improved. I think victims at the point of reporting should be given much more help and advice, and often the advice and support they get is several months later, and they've lost interest. Then they've moved on. And obviously, most importantly, very few victims, receive a police investigation resulting in some form of justice. And of the 52 interviews that we conducted, in those 52 victims, only 4 actually received justice with some kind of criminal justice outcome. Many victims didn't even receive any contact from the police. So I think a lot more could be done to help these victims.
Right, that's interesting. So, okay, so you mentioned Action Fraud. Just out of curiosity, is there anything that you feel that they could do better?
Well, one of the things that we are recommending is that Action Fraud changes its name. It's obviously called Action Fraud, but it's the reporting centre for cybercrime as well. And we think the name should reflect what it actually is and the kinds of reports it accepts. So the National Fraud and Cybercrime Reporting Centre, we think, would be a better name. It would also reflect what it's actually doing. We did find some victims who thought that it was some kind of special police squad doing investigations because of the word action. We think the website could be better in terms of offering advice and support. And we think also they could direct a lot more quickly information and guidance and support to victims as they report, so that victims get that support on reporting, not several months later. So several things we think that Action Fraud could do better.
Okay. And have you made any other recommendations at all on the basis of your report?
Yes, we've made 12 recommendations, and they cover a wide range of different areas, but some of the most important, we think there should be, for instance, a clear website offering advice and support with extensive information, support and guidance, which all the websites link to, so that there aren't divergent websites. We think that victims should receive regular information on the progress of their case. And that they should receive advice and support upon reporting. We've also recommended that there should be more information provided by these bodies, and we've also made a recommendation that the police should have more resources to deal with this. And a lot of police forces, the funding for these types of units is on a short-term basis, which seems mad when you consider that this is, one of the most significant voluminous crimes out there, doing, as we found, quite serious damage. Also, we found that a lot of victims actually want to have some kind of technical support. Clearly, this is kind of challenging for the police to do, and we don't think maybe the police are the best place to do that, but perhaps some kind of scheme that recognises high quality providers of IT technical support in the security area, that also, make sure that these people are competent and not criminals. Some kind of scheme that victims can easily go to, and then obviously pay for high quality advice, which we found some victims struggle to get that kind of support. We think would also help. So 12 recommendations, and obviously the important ones as well in relation to action fraud that we've already discussed in terms of name, offering that direct support and changing the reporting websites. So lots of recommendations, and hopefully these will be implemented and create a much better system and structure of support for these types of victims.
Okay. That's very interesting. So can you just enlighten us before we wrap up, how did your study find that people tended to become victims of this crime?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Some victims didn't have any idea how they became a victim, and that may have reflected that they had their personal details had been compromised in a wider hack. We see quite a large number of big organizations whose passwords of customers, etc., and personal details get hacked and get put into the the criminal domain through the dark web, etc., and people utilize that. So some victims that kind of route. For some victims, though, it was down to poor security behaviors. They had simple passwords or passwords related to guessable things like the names of their children. Some victims used multiple passwords for the same accounts. So some victims, that was the reason that they fell victim. But also we must remember that some fraudsters are very sophisticated in their social engineering tactics. And so we did find some victims that were phoned up by very realistic individuals purporting to be bodies like BT, for instance, who then trick them into giving access of their computer to the criminals. Individuals who, received emails that look very realistic. We also found some victims who had what they described as, a weak point. They were particularly busy that day, or they're distracted. And at that point, the criminals struck with, sophisticated social engineering techniques. And, probably most worrying of all, we found victims who were highly skilled IT security specialists who were also victims. They were able to be targeted and attacked because of the sophistication or sometimes the insider knowledge of the criminals. So a wide range of reasons why individuals actually fell victim.
Okay, thank you for that. So, well, thank you very much for your time on the whole, Professor Barton. Before we go, though, and wrap up this interview, can you just let our audience know where they can find you, or if they're interested in any further reading?
Yes, at the end of this video, there will be a link to the report. We'll also put the report on the Centre for Counter-Fraud Studies website, and there's a shorter, glossy executive summary and a much fuller report, which we'll be making available. And we really love you to have a look at it.
Okay, thanks again, Professor Barton, for your time. Thank you.